In this segment, we will be discussing the oral cavity, which is the mouth. And you will already recognize several familiar structures such as the teeth, the tongue, the hard palate, the soft palate, which continues on, and you have this little flap hanging off of it called the uvula, and that will hopefully prevent food from inadvertently going up into the nasopharynx when you swallow it and direct it down into the proper passage here, which is the esophagus, which will then lead to the stomach. So the mouth is a very important part because this is where the whole process of digestion begins with ingestion. Ingestion is the first part of the job of the intestinal tract, and that is the taking in of the food and the liquids that we will then use later on. So we've got within the mouth, we've got several major functions, not the least of which is the sensory analysis of food. Now, when you eat food, obviously you're not going to eat something that looks rancid or looks spoiled or smells bad. But once you put it in your mouth, you can actually taste what it tastes like. And you might be able to taste if there's something poisonous there, if it's too acidic, if there's quinine, if there's something that could be problematic for you or make you sick. The other thing you can do with this sensory analysis is figure out if it's too hot or too cold. How many times have we made our coffee or our tea too hot? And then we take our first sip, we end up spitting it out. And that is to prevent us from damaging the mucosa of the mouth and the esophagus. Other things we have in the mouth, obviously, are teeth and tongue. And these are important for the mechanical processing of food. As we know, and we'll look at a little bit later on, the teeth have different occlusal surfaces, which are surfaces designed for specific types of actions like cutting, grinding, punching holes in things, tearing things. And we use these teeth to break down food into smaller bits that can then be mixed with saliva, which is full of water and digestive enzymes, and we can create this thing called a bolus. And the bolus is this mass of material, of ingested material, that contains the food material that we ingested, along with these fluids that we have secreted in the mouth. Then we have the palatal surface, which will assist the tongue in further kind of mushing the food up and also mixing it with saliva. In saliva, we also have mucus. So mucins are produced, and that will make mucus in the oral cavity, which will help lubricate the oral cavity and allow for an easier passage of that bolus from the oral cavity into the esophagus. As we've noted before, we start our digestion of carbohydrates by the production of salivary amylase, and we also start the digestion of lipids through the production of lingual lipase. So the oral mucosa is the lining of the oral cavity, and as we know, it is a stratified squamous epithelium. Most of it is non-keratinized. So we have the lips, called the labia, that are continuous with the cheeks. That epithelium is continuous, and it is a stratified squamous epithelium. But we also have the inferior of the surface of the tongue, which is also thin and non-keratinized. And this is where we can absorb certain medicines. So we actually have enough blood vessels and a thin enough epithelium that certain lipid-soluble substances can be absorbed under the tongue. And you'll notice the tongue is held in place, if you look under your tongue, by this little thin little piece of material that holds it to the floor of the mouth called the lingual frenulum. We will find that the cheeks, which are the sides of your face, are going to have little pads of fat that are deep to the surface, and they lie between the mucosa and the buccinator muscle and then the skin on the outside. The other surfaces, for example, the dorsal surface of the tongue and the hard palate, will be covered with a keratinized epithelium, because this is where we're going to see a lot of our abrasion, as our tongue is being used to smush around boluses or bits of food, and it's using the hard palate to separate them. So here's a picture again. Here's our tongue, and the keratinized surface will be the dorsal surface. And then we'll have the upper surface of the mouth here, the roof of the mouth, the hard palate, will be covered in a keratinized epithelium. We will also have little ridges all along the hard palate that will aid in digestion and then the mechanical breakdown of food particles. All right, so we know we have the lips, which are also called the labia. Labia means lips. The vestibule is the space between the lips and the gingiva, and the gingiva are the gums. And you've probably heard the term gingivitis. That would be a swelling of the gums and is problematic. This is a common problem that dentists encounter, as if you have a swelling of the gingiva, then the person is losing some of their connection, holding their teeth into their mouth. So gingivitis is not a good thing. Gingiva are the gums, and the epithelium is continuous with that of the lips and with the cheeks. And so we will find that this is also a stratified squamous, non-keratinized epithelium. And the space between the gingiva and the other structures, such as the lip and the cheeks, is called the vestibule. All right, we've already talked a little bit about the gingiva, and they're going to be surrounding each tooth, and they're going to be surrounding that alveolar process. The tongue itself, as we know, is a very large muscle, and it's going to compress food, abrade it, it's going to mix it up with the saliva that we produce, and it's going to help prepare material for swallowing. It also has a lot of receptors on it, so it's got taste buds with taste receptors, and you can tell many things about the properties of food. For example, its temperature as well. There are temperature receptors on the tongue. And you can also tell, well, what is this thing? Obviously, hard candy is going to have a different type of feel to it than something mushy like mashed potatoes. We will also have secretion of mucins, which is going to make mucus when it's mixed with water, and our lingual lipase, which is our enzyme that's going to start the digestion of fats. We have 3 sets of salivary glands that we've looked at before, and we can look at a picture of them in the next slide. So once again, we have our parotid salivary gland, which is going to be right below the zygomatic arch and on that posterior part of the masseter. So this is the masseter. You recall the masseter has its origin on the zygomatic arch and its insertion in the mandible, and this will assist in chewing. So our parotid salivary gland is located here, and it'll produce about 25% of saliva, I should say. And that saliva is drained into the oral cavity via this parotid duct. Then we're going to have our submandibular glands here, and there's one on each side, and these are right below the mandible, as the name implies. And these are going to be producing about 70% of our salivary product. Then we have our sublingual gland here. This is obviously going to be producing our lingual lipase, and it's going to produce about 5% of our saliva. Our parotid gland will be producing a lot of our salivary amylase. So we see there are differences in the composition of the saliva that these things produce. And we'll look at that in a little bit more detail later on. Some will produce more mucousy secretions that are more dominated by mucus, where others will have more watery secretions. All right, well, here's the slide telling about what percentage of saliva is produced by each salivary gland or each set of salivary glands. And throughout the course of the day, you'll be producing about 1 to 1.5 liters of saliva. So just as this is a 1 liter bottle of water. So you imagine you're producing at least this much, maybe 1.5 this much liters of saliva each day. And so that's quite a bit. And you're constantly swallowing throughout the day. All right, saliva is mostly water. It will include other things like salt, like our sodium chloride here, our bicarbonate ion. Bicarbonate is a buffer. We're going to make some mucins, which are glycoproteins. We will also have some antibodies, which is important because this is one of our first lines of defense. When we put things in our mouth, there could be pathogens in it. Obviously, we're going to have some enzymes in there too. All right, so obviously not only does saliva start the process of digestion, but it's also going to lubricate the mouth. It's also going to dissolve the chemicals that are going to allow us to taste. So the taste buds, in order for them to operate and in order for them to bind the chemical ligands that are going to activate them, they're going to have to be dissolved in some kind of medium. So they're going to be dissolved in saliva. We also have our, well, as we said before, our digestion of complex carbohydrates, that is starches and complex sugars, by salivary amylase. All right, the teeth. These are a very important part of the mouth. And the teeth are going to be grinding and smashing and tearing and ripping and cutting food. And you notice we have different types of teeth, which we'll get into in a minute. And each of these different types of teeth are specialized for particular types of cutting movements or tearing movements. And the surfaces of the teeth that you actually engage with the food are called the occlusal surfaces. So these are the things that you're actually using to chew and to cut up the food. And the verb for chewing food is to masticate. So mastication is the process of chewing up food. All right, so to look at the parts of the teeth, it's probably a little bit easier to look at the picture. So here we have a tooth, and we can see that it's got a crown, which is the head part. It's got a neck, sometimes called the cervical region because it means neck, and then we have the root. And the root is what's going to be buried in the alveolar process of, if it's a bottom tooth of the mandible, if it's a top tooth of the maxilla. You remember our alveolar processes in the bone in which the teeth sit. The tooth will be bound into this by, it's going to be covered with this outer layer of cementum, which is then going to be bound by the periodontal ligament to the underlying osseous tissue. Now we will notice that we've got several layers within this tooth. The cementum is what's going to be below the neck of the tooth. And then above the neck we have this enamel. And enamel is probably the hardest, it is the hardest biological surface. So it's the hardest surface in the human body. And it's about 96% mineralized, so it's quite hard. We have below that dentin, and dentin is throughout the entire tooth. So dentin is a living substance, and it is able to repair itself, whereas enamel is not. Once enamel is made, before the tooth erupts through the surface of the gum, once it's made, that's what you've got. So this is why it's important to avoid cavities, because cavities occur when you have bacterial activity that secretes acids and other things that will eventually erode the enamel of the tooth. So this is why a good dental hygiene program is very important, because you want to preserve this enamel as much as possible because it does not renew. Now the dentin, on the other hand, has capability of maintaining itself. Below the dentin we have the pulp. This is the pulp cavity right here. And we also have within the root, here's the root, we have the root canal. And the root canal allows for the passage of blood vessels and sensory neurons. So this is a very important part of the tooth, in that if you get an infection here, it can be quite bad. In fact, infections, pathogens can hide out here, and it's hard for the immune system to get them. And then they can cause, if you have a dental abscess or an abscessed tooth, then that can actually lead to all kinds of other problems. So abscessed teeth are very serious business, and that you need to take care of them immediately if you have one. Now, you've probably all heard of having a root canal done, and that is where, if the tooth has decayed inside and this part is dying, the dentist will come and ream out the root canal, kill all these nerves and lymphatics, and here, just fill this in. So this is a living part of the tooth. This is also a living part of the tooth. So these can be quite sensitive. So once the enamel has been eroded, then you can see problems when the erosion and the acids and things from the outside can easily have access to the underlying material. We also can see the gingiva here, and there's a little gingival sulcus, usually between the crown of the tooth and the gum. So there's usually a little sulcus here, and that's usually what the dentist is checking when they measure the depth of that dental sulcus to make sure, or gingival sulcus, to make sure that you're not having a receding gum line. Now, one of the biggest causes of tooth loss is erosion of the actual bone that holds it in place. So a lot of times that alveolar process will wear away, and that will expose the root. And of course, the root is not covered with enamel. So that makes it much easier for external things, acids and whatnot, to have access to this and start to erode away the tooth. Once the gingiva and the bone has exposed the root of the tooth, it's very hard that tooth becomes very vulnerable, and probably will be lost unless something is done to reinforce the connection of the tooth with the bone. And sometimes you can have a graft. You can have a graft where they'll take tissue from the palate of the mouth and they'll transplant it and reinforce the gingiva here. All right, we've got several types of teeth. We have got incisors, which are the first two. You've got a front incisor and a lateral incisor. You've got your canine teeth, also called the eye teeth. You've got bicuspids, which are premolars, and then molars. And they can vary by the number of roots that they have. Most of the front teeth have one root, whereas some of the back teeth here will have one to several roots. Usually the molars in the upper jaw have three roots. The ones in the lower jaw, it can vary. Now, we typically, before I get into the details of them, most adults will have 32 teeth. We have, if you recall, we've got two sets of teeth. We've got the baby teeth, which come in first, and there are 20 of those. And then the adult set of teeth can be up to 32 teeth, and that includes the wisdom teeth. Some people never have wisdom teeth, so we have 28 teeth. But in any case, the full adult dentition, the dentition is the set of teeth. The full adult dentition is anywhere between 28 and 32 teeth. If you have your wisdom teeth, then it's 32 teeth. We have the incisors, which are the front teeth. We've got the two front incisors and the two lateral incisors on either side of it, on both the top and the bottom. And these occlusal surfaces are thin and long, like chisels. And so they're good at cutting things, and these have a single root. The cuspids are sort of next to it. These are your vampire teeth. They're sometimes called the eye teeth because they're located right under the eyes. These are conical, and these are the ones that in dogs are very elongated, and hence the name canines. And these have a pointed tip and are good for puncturing things and shearing things or tearing things. Then we've got our bicuspids, which are also called premolars with flattened crowns, and as the name implies, these have two cusps, and they're good at grinding things. These can have 1 to 2 roots. Then we've got our molars, which have large flat crowns, which are good for crushing things and grinding things. So obviously we've got our dental succession. So we've got the deciduous teeth, which are the primary set. That's the baby teeth. And deciduous is like shedding. So if you talk about deciduous trees, these are trees that shed their leaves in the fall. And the secondary dentition is your adult teeth. This is the permanent dentition. As we've said, the primary dentition has 20 teeth, and the secondary dentition, if you have the full set of teeth, including the wisdom teeth, is going to be 32 teeth. So here is the primary dentition. Here we can see our central incisors, lateral incisors. We have the cuspids here, the canines. We've got some first molars. And then you can see approximately what age they come in. And so this typically will start very early on at about 6 months and continue coming into about 2 years. And then our secondary dentition, let's go back to this one here. So our secondary dentition is going to include all 38 teeth. So here we have our central incisors, our lateral incisor, then we have our canine here. We've got 2 premolars, and you can see they have 2 cusps. And then we've got our first and second molars, which almost all adults have. And then our third molars, which come in late, and these are the wisdom teeth. And this is just the top dental arcade. That is the maxillary dental arcade, which means this is the top teeth. Now, if you go into dental hygiene, one thing that will be interesting to you is how to number the teeth. So whenever you look at a treatment plan, the dentist will specify the tooth by number, and basically we number them starting from this side, and you got to remember that this is the right side because this is the patient. So you're looking in the patient's mouth, so the patient is your left is going to be the patient's right and vice versa. So I always start from the right side, and we start from the upper arcade, And we number them 1 through 16. And then in the lower arcade, we go around just like a clock. We pick up 17, 18, 19, 20, all the way through 32. And if you are, say, born without your third molars, then you would actually start with tooth number 2. You would not have a tooth number 1. So your treatment plan would start with tooth number 2, and you have 8 and 9 up here, and then over here you'd have 15, but you would have no 16. So that's an aside for people going into dental hygiene, because that's the most common numbering system you'll see for teeth. All right, here is a picture of the deciduous teeth, and when they come through the surface, they do what we call erupt. So these are erupted deciduous teeth. Here you can see the secondary dentition developing in the mandible that is underneath these deciduous teeth. And eventually what will happen is the roots of these teeth will be absorbed by the gums, and then they will fall out. And then the secondary dentition will start to erupt behind them. And the molars will not start to erupt until the jaw is actually big enough to accommodate them. So this is why they appear later in life. So they appear when the person is getting older and getting closer to their full adult size and have their adult mandible size. All right, so mastication is chewing, and this is basically passing food over the occlusal surfaces of the teeth.